I'm Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Professor Phil Cerny. Professor Phil Cerny is an Emeritus Professor at the University of Manchester, and we'll be discussing today the restructuring world politics, the dialectics of globalization and fragmentation. Thank you for being with us, Professor.
Thank you, yes.
Professor Cerny, can you please explain to us what comprises new anarchy?
Right. Well, to some extent, the concept of new anarchy is derivative because in international relations theory, anarchy is taken to be what Kenneth Waltz said it was. In other words, that you have, well, there's a distinction theoretically between hierarchy and anarchy. Hierarchy means a complex system of centralized system of power, and Waltz calls states unit actors. But he says that in the wider world there is no, obviously, governance structure, so it's like anarchic, it's like without rule, which is what the word anarchy means. So the new anarchy is something that I've developed, but also with a colleague at the University of Exeter called Alex Pritchard, in which we say that the anarchy is not of states within an international system, but it's of states, non-state actors of all different kinds at various levels. So it's what in another context I call multinodal politics or multi-layered politics. Other people talk about a heterarchy. And I think the idea is that there's nobody that we expected in a modern world that state actors would make the rules and would apply them both domestically and internationally in different kinds. I think Putnam called it two-level games. But what we're arguing is that there are multi-level games going on at all time which crisscross each other. And also, with particular reference, say, to the security issue area, I had an article 20 years ago called The New Security Dilemma, whereas the security dilemma was, as expressed by John Hertz and others, was about the relationship of states and how they interacted with each other in actually moving away from security to greater insecurity. I was arguing that again that the new security dilemma was about non-state actors, because we're working towards civil wars, we're working towards ethnic and tribal loyalties. We're talking about also at another level the role of corporations and other forms of globalization. So it's the nation state is being we're arguing the nation state is being kind of challenged and hollowed out and undermined at a variety of different levels. It no longer has the power to be a unit actor.
Thank you very much. And can you please explain to us how globalization has had an impact on the nation state and in political systems across the world?
Well, there are all sorts of different levels at which this happens. The most obvious one is because the concept of globalization was originally begun by certain kinds of economists who would argue that it was global supply chains, that it was multinational corporations, that it was, in particular, increasingly, financialization. That all these kinds of processes were meaning that the nation state as a controller of what happens economically is no longer the same as it was, and nation states can't control what these transnational or cross-national bodies and whatever, including things like monopolization. I mean, we talk about these days about Facebook and Amazon and the so-called FANGs being the new monopolies of this world, partly because they operate in a way which is very different from what the old monopolies did, because they were much more nationalized. So I think the idea here is that globalization starts off with some of these economic dimensions, but also it goes further in the sense that, for example, with information technology, people know, and social media, people know what's happening around the world in various different ways. With migration, you have different forms of, people seeing themselves not just in a local context, but in an international context. I suppose you would go back and say some of this was true with the emigration from Europe and China to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But I think this is much more spread around the world these days, that people's identities are much more to do with what's happening to them in a particular situation, whether they could find something better or different, not just refugees, but also people looking for different kinds of jobs and different kinds of personal security. So all these kinds of things, also, even if you look at sort of tribalism and ethnic identities, these are ones which are increasingly seen to be not just located within a nation, the concept of a nation being a kind of unified ethnic identity of some kind, but it's multi-ethnic within societies, but also people are aware of what others. For example, the notion that Islam is cross-cutting across nation states, the way it always has been. Catholicism cross-cutting across nation states. Evangelical Protestantism is moving around the world. So all these kinds of things are part of this wider process of globalization, which, as I say, makes the nation state. A nation state is still crucial, but it is less significant in terms of actually being able to control and manage the outcomes of different kinds of conflicts and policy issues.
Thank you very much. And you have unraveled the role played by non-state actors, but can you please explain to us the role played more specifically by civil society in this whole process?
Well, that's problematic, because I'm not sure that my impression is, generally speaking, that civil society is being fragmented by these same kinds of processes that we're talking about, processes that are above. I mean, civil society is no longer a national civil society. And the less national it is, in some senses, the less civil it is. That you don't have that same kind of identity with a particular social category or social group. And so I would say that what needs to happen, if we're going to have a better world system, and I don't like the word international either, because that implies that it's between nation states. If you're going to have a better world system, you're actually going to have the development of a transnational concept of civility. And I don't think that's happening. Now, somebody like Steven Pinker might disagree with me. Do you know his book, Enlightenment Now? He might disagree with me and say that these things are developing. But I'm not sure that they're there yet, and I think that the outcome is more like, at the moment, is more like one of muddling through than actually having some kind of clear. Certainly, global governance is not developing as kind of civil society around itself. It's all divided up by issue areas and competing institutions and all that sort of thing. And by the way, let me just say that one of the terms that I use, and it's not my own term, but I believe that it was started back in the 1970s by, I'm trying to remember the name of the author of the most famous international relations theory book of the 1970s. Anyway, basically neo-medievalism, that we live in a world where the most simple definition, although there are many other definitions, and I could go into this in great depth if you wanted me to, but I don't think you will, competing institutions with overlapping jurisdictions. And I think that's where we're talking about everything from global governance right down to the new tribalism.
Fascinating. And wrapping up our interview, if you could please highlight how the field of sociology might have an impact in international relations in the near future.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is not so much sociology as such, because sociology has always been interacting with economic. I mean, maybe some of the more traditional economists wouldn't like to know this, but sociology and economics are, come from the same set of issues that they're facing. They just face them in different ways. And but I think what we're talking about here is not so much the individual disciplines, but more about how the disciplines interact. And I think sociology is an essential part of this. But I would say, I think I think I mentioned this to you before we started, that there's something called international political economy, which to some people is quite a limited sub-discipline of international relations. And some people call it global political economy, by the way. But I see international or global political economy as not being interdisciplinary. I've know other friends like Ben Rosamond who would call it transdisciplinary, but I actually think it's supradisciplinary. In other words, it brings together and integrates all the other disciplines in explaining what's happening in world politics, which is it's world politics, not international relations.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us, and for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.